the first two of your comments reminded me of something that is very much striking in both your work and indeed. The first part of the comment on misrecognition, and then your comments about Edward Thompson responding. Because what's so striking in your response, both of you were very much concerned with holding two things, it seems to me, simultaneously. One is the continuing salience of, as it were, a sort of materialist economic and social phenomena. And on the other hand, a refusal to reduce things, as he would put it, to the belly, right? And those remarkable sort of things. But part of the imperative is refusal to go one way or the other. And that somehow, and the reason that's important for misrecognition is misrecognition. Like, it's simultaneously going to be the case that the thing itself, the economic history, and the misrecognition of the economic history are both really important. That, I find, is an incredible challenge, and also a demand that we need to place on ourselves. So to understand how misrecognition matters, without it only being, say, it's a great challenge. And I have accidentally ended up writing about the National Security Agency in the past 6 months. Truly accidental. I was expecting. Hi guys. And one of the things I'm struggling with is I simultaneously want to understand a way in which it's crucial to the conversation that terrorism be classified as an asymmetrical text. And yet, at some level, when someone from the national security world comes to me and says, what about this? There is this sort of reality. Well, if I only take one of those polls, I have failed, right? And I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to hold those things in contention. But enough of me.
Well, I was actually struck by some of your comments around sort of the accidents in the archive. I think probably all of us have had those moments. I know for me, I've discovered that there were, the work that I do is on the transition from slavery to freedom in British colonial Antigua, which is a very small island in the Caribbean. And, again, that sort of idea that there's so much happening in this, kind of oft left out part of the world that, is sort of very crucial to happenings in other sort of prominent parts of the world, right? That kind of thing, I don't even, sometimes I'm sort of so stuck on my small place that I don't even realize some of the bigger currents flowing into it, even in the form of just individual persons. So I managed to miss, in the course of doing the dissertation research for now, what's becoming the book, this one set of papers around a fugitive slave from the United States who used the Underground Railroad to end up in Philadelphia from Kentucky, where he's laboring on a plantation. He escapes his master, uses that Underground Railroad, ends up in Philadelphia, poses as a free man and gets on a ship bound for Jamaica. And he decides that he's going to do that instead of doing what normally most slaves going north would do, which is head to Canada. And so as he gets on this ship and poses as this free man, he knows that, knowing the British Empire has freed its slaves before the United States has, and he knows Jamaica is part of the British Empire, and he's saying, yes, I'm going to claim freedom once I get to Jamaica. And then the ship is rerouted to Antigua, and he has no idea where he is and what's going on there. He's never heard of Antigua. The whole idea of what he does to sort of maneuver his way off the boat onto shore to discover what, first of all, is the status of this place, and how then can he insinuate himself within whatever is going on in this place as a free person, is an incredible accident of the archive, right? And then the war of words that ensues between what is the United States and the English colonial authorities in Antigua over him actually being, because he's eventually seized off the ship in the name of British Admiralty law, which, the British are policing the seas at this point and trying to end the slave trade in other places. So this guy, this one slave, creates this whole international kind of controversy over, his kind of very clandestine movements, and I keep thinking about people like that. Again, the go-betweens, the people who sort of have extraordinary mobility, extraordinary lives that seem oftentimes accidental. It's always through these very, kind of moments of contingency in history. that none of this is supposed to, you know, have happened, but it does happen, and it then sort of brings to bear the questions around what are the sorts of convergences in history that, you know, at the very same time that Britain is trying to figure out what its identity is going to be as an empire that is free now and, you know, engaged in free labor, it's coming face to face with its former colony that's still sort of holding on to a slave way of life. And, you know, over the form of this one person, there's this back and forth. I'm so excited about things, you know, moments like that where, you know, again, the archive could be read both sympathetically and against the grain. And so, you know, that's sort of, those are the kinds of things that I'm hoping to maybe embark on for the next book that, you know, where those accidents happen with people who we think can't get to move, like slaves, for instance. So, so that's what came to mind for me.
I mean, on one side, I would say that for me, the problem of misrecognition is a kind of, to my mind, kind of intrinsic to any kind of anthropology that I would do. I think it's like from a Max Weber kind of starting point of a certain disjoint between intentionality and the facts of what we do. Partly, I think that's kind of ontological position. I don't have, I can't have that position. So, but and partly you can do it with a sort of that famous, you know, sort of man thinks, God laughs kind of view of the world. Or even if you go to the Marx thing and say, well, the people make history, but they don't make it, you know, on their own terms. But one would have to then add, even when they're making it, they don't always affect things the way they believe they're going to affect them. So there is a problem between intentionality and effects that I think is part of what we're constantly grappling with. One of the things that since I'm not a professional historian, one of the things that working in history has, and I constantly work in history, one of the things that history does for me of the kind that you have done, and that is that it produces a kind of tension to me between what I would call something like the map and the portal or something like that. There's a constant tendency that we have to map, to want to lay things out in relation to one another. We sometimes will call that directly a map, some kind of iconic representation of reality, or sometimes we can go more sophisticated and talk about structure, but still it is a mappable kind of, that is, you can design it, you can draw it out. And what the history does to me is that it provides something like a portal that is something that looks, if you look at it on a two-dimensional plane, like a map or a shape that's recognizable, but then all of a sudden, boom, it takes you somewhere else, and that somewhere else actually no longer has the same shape. I'm sorry to talk about so in such a figurative language. I don't have more theoretical language with which to put it. To me, that is what that tension between this, what I'm calling the portal and the map, is what draws me constantly to historical work. As a result, it draws me to these strange places that I don't always predict, and the way in which I feel drawn often is around difficulty in understanding or a text. In my case, sometimes those are very recent texts, which is one of the things that's puzzling me. Maybe this has something to do with this issue of finding one's work in other people's work, because sometimes one has lived with another person's work and has not felt that connection, and the connection all of a sudden happens at a certain point. There is this, this is a kind of religious language. At first I talk figurative, now I'm religious, but there's a kind of moments of epiphany where something means when it was opaque before. Not that meaning necessarily is the meaning or the right meaning, but simply that it speaks to you or that it draws you in. The kind of archival work which I do, which I don't think would light a candle to that of anyone on this table, is one that is involved with trying to grapple with a set of pieces of paper, texts that one can put in conjunction with another in order to spark some kind of story or storytelling. In this sense, I think that for me, the question really is often like history, kind of from where? I mean, whereas when I grew up in, let's say, Mexico, it was historia para qué? What for history? For me, it wasn't so much what for, but from where? From where are you writing this? Why are you drawn to that text? And that,
where are you coming from?
Where are you coming from? That's right. Where are you drawn from that text? And then the writing has to do with that particular trajectory, which is one of the reasons why I so appreciate this work of yours on trajectories, where you take the considerable work of following a person or a trajectory. I think that's very important.
Against the grain. Nothing interests me if it didn't surprise me and confound me, and I didn't expect to find it there. So I like to think of whatever gets produced out of my work as the kind of pearl that could only happen if there was that irritating grain of sand. And this, again, comes about by having received almost a canonical set of expectations, both in terms of historiography, but also in terms of method, what we expect to find in certain places and times. And then when you don't find it, or when there's something there that shouldn't be there, something in the 16th century that you only thought was modern, or something that's really anomalous, and you follow the trail, the crumbs, so to speak. And that is true for my book about these little calendars, which when I asked a librarian if he had anything from the pre-19th century, he says, yes, I have a whole shoebox full. It's sitting on my desk. I never knew what to do with it. It was not cataloged. It was not listed anywhere. They had no idea what it was. And it turned out to be filled with rich surprises. My forthcoming work is based on a line that came out at me from a work that I opened up and read about writing marriage contracts, Jewish marriage contracts for prostitutes. What? What are they for prostitutes? And just figuring out what they meant by that. They didn't mean professionals. They ended up meaning maidservants who became pregnant by their owner, on the job. There were many of them. Once you begin to open up the records, a whole underworld that I didn't expect existed, certainly not in any record, was there. It was clearly there. And that kind of gives you the fuel to find out what the story was, how this happened, and why, and what the silences around it, how they were created, and how to kind of pierce those.
Elisheva was talking before about moving in a new line. I've forgotten your phrase, but I just wanted to add that in addition to the looking for the things against the grain, that you've written with courage. That is not only this surprising book, which Tony Grafton reviewed on the calendars, that was a surprise, something that people didn't know, not in shoeboxes, it wasn't supposed to exist, this enormous literature. But I think your book on conversion, I talked last night about a Jew who made a really stupid strategic conversion, but you took on this topic, which is a very sensitive one in Jewish history, and ran with it. So I think that's writing against the grain sometimes takes a while. I wanted to just make a comment that is maybe taking the map, the interesting map portal image, in a slightly different direction from what you intended, but I wanted to just describe it. And I don't know if other people here have shared this experience. I want to use it to talk about the difference between describing a situation in the historical past, where it might be very hard to get the documents because people are dead and you can't interview them. Describing it and seeing how it changed. And I had a huge problem with this in my book on the gift in 16th century France, which I worked on for many years. And it was partly because it was inspired partly by reading Bose, Marcel Mauss, and also when I first thought about it, and I say this in the beginning in the introduction, we were living in Reagan's America. I just heard enough about the market. Enough already. This is back before you and before another. Enough already. Let's think about other ways of exchanging things. So it was both a very deeply professional, scholarly excitement about Mauss, and I spent a long time on it because I had wanted to start off, and I say this in the book, in saying that gifts, that the stage theory, which was very strong and it's present to some extent, somewhat moderated in most. That first you have gifts and then you have bargains. And it's not blanket in most, but it's there pretty strongly. So I was dealing with that. And I wanted to see if I could put my work in the 16th century in some kind of a longer historical frame, so that I could see after the 16th century. And I found that, and I still find it, very, very difficult. There's this interesting new book that I haven't yet read on debt by the man at Harvard who's written this, which is very, I think also, but on a grand scale, it's a grand vision. It has a kind of probably interesting stage theory. But at any rate, there's still a lot of writing that works in that direction. And what I kept seeing, and I see it still as actually Derrida's writing on this, for sure, was the zero-sum game argument. That first you have to have this, and then you have that, and it's very hard for them to exist. And it seemed to me that the evidence that I had from the 16th century showed just constant crossovers, that there were areas in which the gift practices and the gift justifications, so they understood it, were primary. Others where markets were taking over, and then a huge area which you could document through ritual and expression of crossover. And that there was, so that it seemed to me at that point more interesting to look at the tension between them. But it was also that I couldn't do what I'm thinking was the portal, because I wasn't really sure without a huge amount of research how to really do the 17th and 18th century, how even do anything more than imagine it. So that what I ended up doing was a map, that is to try to map, just to say, okay, I'm an historian, but I'm not going to look at change. I am going to affirm that gifts and sales exist simultaneously, and that's interesting. That's not boring, that is interesting. But I finally, I wasn't going to write that book if I didn't just say, well, I'm going to do it as a map. It wasn't only structures, but there's a lot of practices and interactions and so forth. But just make it a description and just let it be, rather than and that historians are supposed to show how things change. These other people expect us to do it, and I thought, well, maybe it's just going to have to be useful to just tell people about how gifts work in every aspect, credit to kings, peasants, and the whole. Well, just try to do it. But it's sometimes a difficult choice for us if you take, and my out, and maybe it's the easy path out, has been rather to, when I looked at change, it has been on a smaller scale, that is in life stories or in a smaller community, rather than doing the grand scheme, which I'm glad some people do, but that's not what I do. But so what I have been, the portal, it has been within a smaller range of time, or within something that I could get my hands on. It may be my own lack of, I don't know, courage, but experience is a feeling that I don't have the evidence to be able to really to talk about it and say the gift as it changes in the 17th, 18th century without doing a huge amount of work. So anyway, I just wanted to share that as the kind of, that sometimes historians have to do maps, a version of maps rather than the portal.
Before opening the floor for questions, I'd like to make a comment. It's not really a question, it's a comment about, comment in form of a kind of a lesson I drew from your work and your some of the words that we've heard tonight, of the couple of structure is just agency, or another word that I think has been important tonight is the term courage. And to this I'd like to add the word autonomy, because it seems to me that you have been autonomous in a very strong way, in the sense that you have given yourself your own role. As a historian, you have advanced in your own way, obviously in the community, obviously in dialogue. I'm saying that in the sense that for me it's a lesson in terms of thinking about what we do as historians today, what is the work of a historian today. And it seems to me that autonomy has, and maybe I'm wrong, but has helped you navigate two dangers. And maybe I'm looking at this danger coming from France. I've been trained in the French tradition. One of them was and still remains, I think, the temptation of fragmentation within the historical work, and the submission to etiquettes, and the idea that we do cultural history or social history or intellectual history, just kidding, or history of science, and that that there's a very strong tendency toward professional fragmentation within the field of history, which I think the work has constantly avoided by not asking this question. Yesterday, the talk was very much an exercise, and it could have been adopted by intellectual historians of looking at the history of linguistics, but it was much beyond that. It was, and you don't care about those etiquettes, and I think that's part of what I found attractive, at least in the work. The other lesson, or the other, lesson in courage, maybe in historical courage, has to do with something that Nat was getting at and was explained much more in a much more articulated way than I did ever do, but it has to do with the relationship between theory and empirical work, which it seems to me that it's maybe that's the case now in in the field of American history, or history as it is practiced in the American Academy, but I'm not sure actually. It seems to me that history often has been, and maybe still is, very much subservient to theoretical discourse, to philosophical discourse, to social theory. And that your work has actually, by asking different kinds of questions, has used quote-unquote theory, or philosophy, or social theory at certain central junctures for your own questions, for your autonomous path. And but it was a kind of utilitarian borrowing, rather than a submission to the larger theoretical framework, which I think has been, for me, is an extremely example of the way we can think, the articulation between the social theory and historical work. That the questions come from the kind of confrontation with the theoretical questions come from a local confrontation with practices and individual trajectories, and that the questions come from there, rather than be imposed by, here I'm really speaking from the French model, Foucault was the model that you had to apply to all kind of history for a long time, and so on and so forth. Maybe more, as I said, a French bias here than really reflective of the American craft. But that's a small comment, it's not really a question. So let's open the floor to the, I'm sure, many questions that put here now.
Natalie, it's a great pleasure to hear you. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the ethics of being a historian of a certain kind, because, and I was thinking particularly in what you were saying about the difficulties of stage theory, the difficulties also of resisting stage theory. And it seems to me that you could say that certain kind of ethical virtues and vices present themselves to the historian who does see things in terms of movement through time. In particular, a certain confidence about the future, a certain obvious political charge to what they do, and equally certain vices attached themselves to that. And contrarily, a historian who resists that connection between the choice of topic and treatment of the past and some vision of the future, must have perhaps has a different sense of the ethics of what they're doing.
Yes.
And I would be very interested to hear your reflections on, as it were, the ethics of the kind of history that you've written.
The advantage that the political advantage that it allows, and by the way, such a position doesn't mean that one doesn't, for instance, pay attention to shifts in the birth rate or health. One is not, it's just that doesn't have to be part of some enormous historical evolution, so it's not indifferent to ways in which people might welcome change. There's an advantage, one moral advantage, is that it gives you a chance to be respectful of, without necessarily agreeing with or giving high grades to, many forms of human behavior. It's a good stance for a historian to have when you're trying to understand. When Bart Bloch said this famous thing, understand first, then you can judge. And that gives you really a chance to stand back and work very, very hard at seeing what other people are doing or up to, where they're coming from, whether today or, and again, it doesn't eliminate possibility of judgment, but I think it gives you a very good set of mental experiences to do that. So that's one, I think that is an ethical plus. The other thing is, and I've said this in my writing several times, I like to think of myself as an historian of hope, without having any necessary belief that things are going to be better. And I'm old now. And so I wonder if I can say about certain things, well, yes, but maybe not in my lifetime. That's, but the hope really comes from seeing that at any period that I've looked at, or any place that I've looked at, that there are always people asking ethical questions. When I'm writing, I don't even have to usually go out, I don't have to even put my own judgment. I can almost always find someone, whatever period I'm writing about any place. I just found somebody new today in Suriname. I was just telling Natasha, and that's a hard place. But anyway, I can usually find someone who is asking the important questions, that has the courage, that goes against the grain, that speaks up, and maybe that's not the utopian hope for a wonderful solution to all things in the future. It's better than nothing. So that's one thing. That spark, it's just always there. And a second thing that can go with this is a version of this idea of agency. And I know this has become a cliche word, but we're not using it in a cliche way. That in any period that you look at, there are people who are finding ways to improvise and cope and to tell stories of some kind. I don't care whether they're true stories or not. They're just stories. They're telling, and that's, to me, a sign of hope, that doesn't die out. So you can have that kind of position, which I consider, it happens to be congenial to my temperament, but I consider that an ethical possibility, and it's one that allows you to see very troubling things in the past as well. And I sometimes will insert an adjective. I used the word last night about an anti-Semitic tract. I used the word nasty. I don't know if you noticed that. Often I'm very sparing about using my own language, but I thought it's okay. It really was a very nasty tract, and it was experiencing. But on the whole, we don't insert that. But the judgment can be found in the people of the time, and they can be spokesmen. And if you happen to agree with them, fine. You have to be loyal to them. Thank you for asking that question.
So Natalie, I first heard you just over 40 years ago at a conference on the massacre of Saint-Barthélemy, the rights of violence. And that was an extraordinary experience. And that as a paper it's the middle of next week when it comes to thinking about religious violence, social violence, scripts and how they're acted out. It's one of the most extraordinary of this extraordinary string of things you've written. So I have a question for you, which might be especially for younger historians here. Just I've done 2 Natalies in these 40 years, and they're not distinct, and they both are the craftsmen, the wonderful maître artisan that Elisheva talked about in the archive. But one of them was the first Natalie I met, who was an anthropologist whose people were the people of 16th century Lyon. And the second is Natalie, who is Leo Africanus, the crosser of borders, the person who can go anywhere and who moves across time and space and borders of method. And I would like you just maybe to reflect a little bit on that and whether there's still a condition of possibility for that in the historical profession now. Is this a model that, because we talk a lot about world history now, I'm not sure we always practice it in a reflective way. I wonder if you would just talk about
That shift?
and what it's meant for you and what it might mean for others. And
Yes.
can we still hope that they will do it?
When I first started, and I remember I was part of a generation that the Wallenderie was in, what really seemed important to do, I was working on the Reformation, and I was working on Max Weber. And Max Weber and Marx, what they had to say about religious change. But I didn't like the Wallenderie, who focused on the peasants of the Languedoc. I thought, let's really find out, let's look at a case in detail. And I had this marvelous material from the where I could, the idea of digging in and really seeing what is going on in the Reformation. And being able to look at the interplay between economic concerns and economic expressions on the one hand and religious change. You had the evidence. And for quite a while, and the archives are so rich, there was quite a while you could get information about, so I in a way, I mean, when I did the rights of violence, I took many examples in France, and the Charivari piece took many examples, but again, they were examples that had first been preceded by looking at very specific cases of ritual, of uprisings in certain places, or carnivalesque expressions. They started with that, and then I could spread it about. Now, the reason I started working on Leo Africanus, my first move outside of 16th century France was when I worked on the 3 women, only one of whom was 17th century France, and Blickel and Maria Sibylla Marion. But you know, I took 3 specific cases. I'm not saying that everybody should do this. This is just the way I like to work. I took where I had autobiographies of very specific material, and I wanted to do comparison. And I thought, well, I've worked in France enough. And I wanted to, well, I specifically, what it really was, I wanted to work on a Jewish person. After all those years, I had worked on Catholics. First I started with the Protestants. Then it was when I gave up the stage theory, I thought, wait a minute, and started working on women. I thought the Catholics aren't that behind. They're not that unprogressive. And then, I'm going to work on a Jewish person, Blickel, whom I had been teaching in a class for at least almost 20 years by that time. I made the move. It is true that it did take, German I knew. My mother spoke Yiddish to her sister when she didn't want us to, or her mother when she didn't want us to understand. I did not know Yiddish, but I could read the Hebrew letters, and I just took the time. And there was a German translation, and this was a Western Yiddish that was still very close to German without that much Slavic in it. So I just took the time to read her Yiddish with the help of the German translation, but checking everything in Yiddish, everything that I was done. So it does take time to get the language and to read around in Weinreich and all you just get, but you know, it's easier to do it when you're older because you sort of know what the techniques are to get into the bibliography. And you know how to ask somebody about the archives in Germany rather than, it is a little bit, I wouldn't encourage a graduate student, maybe some of you are doing this, but I wouldn't necessarily encourage a graduate student to do three different areas unless you were comparative literature and have the languages. So that was the thing, but again, it was very focused. And it was after I did that book, and I mentioned this in other connections, which had Blickel, but it had these 2 women both of whom would go into the New World, one to Quebec, to convert the indigenous people, the First Nations, to Catholicism, and the other who had gone to Suriname and had slaves as her field workers. And when I wrote that book, I thought at one point, am I going to write a book in which I've got these European women doing all these neat things, but there are slave field workers, and what are they? So I tried for that book to some extent I did do some research about the First Nations, about the Iroquois, and there was a little bit, but after that, I thought, no, I don't want to just write the book from the point of view of a European. And other things intervened that were tied up in this interest, such as the mid-1990s, all the political concern about authentic identity, firm boundaries, and you had to have this identity or that identity, next identity. And there were other, think of what was going on with ethnic cleansing in that period. So it really seemed to me to be interesting to look at people who did the kind of crossing that we've been talking about here, that Maria Spillemarian, but maybe taking some other figures. And in a way, the Stedman intermediary went back to the 19th, I first got interested in them. So I was on, I knew about Leo Africanus, I say this introduction, since I was doing Protestantism, because the publisher of the French translation was a Lyon Protestant. And that's interesting, because he was very he writes some of the, and inserts some of the most anti-Islamic phrases into that book. Oh, I'm Protestant from Lyon, but never mind. And that was how I got started in it. And once again, now I was retired, again, I say to the younger people who, when I just had retired, so and I only did a little teaching, so I just took the time, it was a big project, to work up the bibliography. It was a gift, though. I mean, it's so interesting. And then he turned out to be much more interesting than I realized. Then it turned out he was collaborating with a learned Jew whose family had been expelled from Spain at the same time this family had to leave. All of these wonderful things. But just take the time. And I would never have done him if his major texts had been in Arabic, but only a few of them were, just some colophons. But his major texts were in Italian and Latin, and I did work up, did some work in Arabic. But it takes time to do that. Now, I feel lucky to have had that experience, and it keeps getting spin-offs, some of which some of you will see soon. And Wajdi Mouawad is writing a play in which Leo Africanus is one of the characters. And 2016 at Stratford. It will not be exactly a historical play, but it will be great poetry. So just to end on this then, I do feel, it's so thrilling to hear about the work that people younger than I are doing. I feel that there is this range. The one thing that's important about it, and you're such a great scholar, is that it not be done through thinking we've got the right theory and we can take our bag of tricks into any area. It really does require having our historians' bag of tricks, not some big theory, and respect that if you decide to move into another area. I don't think it's the only choice, but I guess the one choice that I do think everybody should make, though, even if you stay, I do think this is, and you see it at the Renaissance Society meetings and so forth, but not always, is that whatever you stick to, you are in dialogue with, even if you do your own thing, that you are in dialogue with the work of other scholars. And I think with the kind of teaching that people are doing, that's the case. But it's not always the case. And you'll sometimes go to, for instance, Renaissance meetings where you will hear the same kinds of questions about Italian poetry, which haven't been informed by different approaches, even though they could stay within Italian poetry. I think that is an important opening, but it doesn't require necessarily changing one's whole language. It can be done through opening one's universe rather than changing one's language base and one's bibliographical and library base.
Adaptations of books.
I don't hear so much of you saying that.
depiction of books on the screen are a common occurrence. However, if I'm not mistaken, you were a consultant for the film entitled Return of Martin Guerre prior to writing the historical essay of the same title. My question was, what were the particular challenges attached with the pre-existence of filmic documents for the historical imagination of the case as you were going to write on it? So going from making film to making history.
I actually did them at the same time. I started out thinking it was just going to be a film, and had the good luck of getting in touch, looking for a filmmaker, had the good luck of getting in touch with Jean-Claude Carrière and Daniel Vigne, they immediately, they had read My Society and Culture, which had come out in French, so they invited me to be on their team for background. And at first I thought this would be fine. I had Claudio's hope of reaching a large audience. And just at first I thought, this is a wonderful story, this would be a movie. And then and even though I sent them all kinds of stuff, and they incorporated all the things that I'd said about the character of the people, they told the story in a way that they said they had simplified it. It still, I think, is a good film in terms of some of the ways that Claudio mentions in terms of the character of village life, the relationships within the family, I think a lot. But the story, the literal story, and especially in regard to Bertrand, is changed and simplified for the film. And so when I saw that, two things happened. One, I said, you have created a romantic 19th century Bertrand, and let me just clean that up for you. I'll just tell you how to change those words and just change these speeches here. And you can tell that story. To tell the historical Bertrand, we would have had to redo the whole narrative structure of that film. It couldn't have been a film in which a whodunit, where you don't know whether he's an imposter till the end. It would have had to been a film in which you knew at the beginning, and the suspense and the intrigue was, is he going to get away with it? So, okay. And that was when we were I was 3 months into working with them, and I said, I'm going to have, and I was rushing to the archives to give them more material about the costumes and this and that. This is a really terrific story. There's much more than I have known, and so I will write a book about it. And they said, fine. They just saw it as a great, business thing, not business. That'll bring in more. They didn't. I thought maybe they would be shocked when I said I'm going to write the truth. So I tried to write the book. The film experience really helped me in two ways. It helped my narrative. I had tried to write accessibly in the society and culture, but it needed to be short. The publisher that they wanted to use said, well, this is the word limit. So I had this word limit, but I didn't mind that. I actually liked to try to make it very compressed and have footnotes with. I liked that, and I learned. I remember the Daniel and the Jean-Claude kept saying, well, we need 20 minutes till he comes back. And I thought, well, I'm going to have 20, what is the equivalent of my 20 minutes in this book? I tried to think about how I was going to do it one way, and then I would retell the story as seen by the judge and as seen by the young lawyer who was in the court. So I had a kind of concept. And I felt it made me write it better. And the other thing, I suggest this in the little preface, is that I got lots of good ideas from about some of the psychological things in that book from talking to the actors. The things that they would ask me about. Some of them were things that, maybe one of them, if you remember, that Pierre Guerre is the one that turns into his nephew, and the man playing Pierre Guerre said, I don't want to play this. I can't play this if he's just doing it for the money. I said, I think you're right. I mean, I actually had been thinking of that, but I felt very confirmed that it wasn't just for the family quarrel, although those could be very tense, but it was also this issue of mistrust that had the deep, the kind of pollution that can come, the uncertainty, the unsettling quality. And I thought that it really made me feel good that he thought that he didn't want to play it that way. And Gerard Depardieu, in the movie, Martin Guerre and Arnaud de T have met. And that is that was a version, actually, of the court had believed But in fact, the court case shows and the other evidence shows that they hadn't ever met. And I was telling the historical story, not the story that's in the movie. And I wondered about that. And I knew that there was a way that Arnaud Duty could get this information from people that they could pick up stories, including probably pick some of them up from the sisters, but that's another, there may have been family collaboration, but never mind about that. But when I saw Gérard Depardieu playing Arnaud Duty, playing Martin Guerre, I suddenly thought, you know, if you really wanted to be a convincing imposter and not an impersonator, it would be better not to have seen the person. Because it's very clear from Arnaud Duty was claiming to be Martin Guerre, not as in the movie, admitting it at the trial, but until just before he was hanged and burned. Then at the very last minute, he said, okay, and he did it probably so that he could get Bertrand off the hook and get her pardoned. In the film, we did it differently as happens in the court, but that was not the way it was. He really, I think, toward the end, thought I deserved to be, and I was taken on that. And when I saw Depardieu, I thought, you know, if you really want to be convinced that you're another person and deserve to be it, it's better not to have seen it. I checked it out later with the psychologist who knew a little bit about this, but it was partly that gave me the idea. Now, I couldn't footnote Depardieu or footnote the guy that played Pierre Guerre, but that's where the ideas, you know, it fit with what I was thinking and some of the evidence that I thought I had. So I was quite, I bet that Claudia probably has all kinds of things to tell us about anthropology and being played. Was that important for you as a play, as your anthropology, when you were in theater?
Well, I mean, when you just described all timing and the requirements of drama and the interrogation between the dramatic structure and the research is very fascinating, because I wrote a play in collaboration with my brother, who was a playwright and theater director, and he would say things like, something needs to happen here. And I would say, no, nothing happened there. Nothing needs to happen there. And we fight for a long, long time until I realized what he was talking about.
You gotta get it.
And it does affect then your research. I agree.
I regret that I didn't have the chance to have a course with you, given I see your passion for history and clarity of expression and hope too. The term I've heard when referring to your work, I've heard the term microhistory. And I want to know if that's ever a term that you've used. Is it a reductive term? What are your thoughts on that?
That was particularly Giovanni Levi and Carlo Ginzburg, whose work I admire very much. I happen not to have used it. I mean, I'm willing to use it, but I have exactly their attitude toward it, that you dig in, just as I had when I was working on the printing workers of Lyon, that you dig into a case because you could get a sense of how processes work, and you could get a close look at, say, the relationship between ideas and different kinds of practices and so on, but that it has a wider, you're interested in it also because it can speak to other things. It can suggest things for other places. It can speak to other places. And it's nice to get a really good example. I mean, Natasha was suggesting that this could be the case. It's the case about her Antigua uprising and her own work, and suggested that this was helpful, and so am I. So when I was thinking about Martin Guerre, I'd like to think I was doing, that was my most anthropological moment in a way. I would like to think I was doing ethnography. I couldn't interview any live peasants, but at least I had actors who were doing it. And I had this case. I was very much influenced by Renato's work and his colleagues. I have to mention, just in this, that I have a little piece coming out. This is connected with this. Very shortly in the periodical Common Knowledge, which I think Tony, and it was I raised this question and talked about that word. Because Keith Thomas, in reviewing a recent memoir, autobiographical memoir by John Eliot, remembers John Eliot's quip. Things are getting to a point where Martin Guerre is going to be more well-known than Martin Luther. And he was kind of worried about this. So I wrote I say, I call it Martin Guerre and Martin Luther, and I show the connections between Martin Guerre and Martin Luther. That in some ways, that you can't, they both part of the same world. And it's important to know about them, they intersect. But in some ways, if you look at the great biographies, including the recent one by the man who was from Suriname. Pardon? Yes, Heiko Obermann, Old Age, and some of the great earlier ones, they are microhistories. That is, Luther is not a representative figure at all. He's an exceptional figure, but speaks enormously to his time, and his exceptionality was one of the things that made his psychological testing of Catholicism so effective. But he was really way out, and the biographies do that. So in a way, what you could say about Luther, what John Eliot said about Minocchio, that he wasn't represented, but in fact he was one of the great changers. Pinocchio didn't change history, nor did Martin Guerre. They don't have a relationship, the big historical change in the same way. They stand for different things. So that will be appearing soon, in this little thing in Common Knowledge, and I'll send it to John. I hope he gets a good laugh.
And we're going to be extremely grateful. We are very grateful to you. And,